I hadn't heard my son's voice in 5 years, so when the phone rang on a quiet Tuesday morning and I saw his name on the screen, the first thing I felt wasn't joy, it was suspicion. Daniel Collins had once been the boy who ran into my arms after school with grass stains on his jeans and stories about baseball practice, the boy who begged me to stay up late helping him finish science projects at the kitchen table. But the man who called me that morning was someone I barely recognized anymore. For 5 years there had been nothing, no birthdays, no Thanksgiving invitations, not even a quick message on Christmas. Silence can grow heavy in a house when you live alone long enough. Mine had settled into the walls like dust. I remember staring at the phone while it rang, the sound echoing softly through the living room of the old 2-story house my husband and I bought more than 30 years ago. The same house where Daniel took his first steps across the hardwood floor, where we measured his height on the pantry wall every summer, marking the years with a pencil line and a date beside it. I almost let the call go to voicemail. Part of me thought it might be easier that way. But curiosity is a powerful thing when you've spent half a decade wondering how your own child could simply disappear from your life. So I answered. Hello? My voice sounded calmer than I felt. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that feels too long, like someone rehearsing what they're about to say. Then I heard it. Mom, it's me. Daniel's voice was deeper than I remembered, but the hesitation was the same as when he used to confess to breaking something in the house. I walked slowly toward the kitchen window while he spoke, looking out at the backyard where the maple tree had grown tall enough to shade half the lawn. My husband planted that tree the year Daniel turned 10. How have you been? Daniel asked. It was such an ordinary question, but after 5 years it sounded strangely hollow, like a line read from a script. I told him I was doing fine. I didn't mention the quiet holidays or the birthdays spent with a single candle on a small cake. I didn't ask why he had vanished from my life the day his wife Rebecca decided I was no longer welcome around their family. Some questions lose their urgency after enough time passes. Instead, I waited. People rarely call after years of silence just to exchange pleasantries. And sure enough, it didn't take long before Daniel cleared his throat and said the words that finally explained everything. Mom, we need to talk about the house. I looked around the kitchen then, at the worn oak cabinets, the familiar coffee mug sitting beside the sink, the faint sunlight stretching across the table where my husband used to read the newspaper every morning. After 5 years of not needing me at all, suddenly my son had remembered I existed. And somehow, I already knew exactly why. I stood there for a long moment after Daniel said those words, holding the phone against my ear while my eyes drifted slowly across the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed quietly behind me, the same old sound it had made every morning for the past 15 years. Outside the window the maple leaves moved gently in the late summer breeze, brushing against the fence my husband built with his own hands one weekend when Daniel was still in middle school. It was strange how ordinary everything looked while something inside me was shifting. Daniel kept talking, explaining that he and Rebecca had been discussing things, that they thought it might be time to make some decisions about the property, about what made sense for everyone moving forward. His voice was polite, careful, almost rehearsed. I listened without interrupting, the way I used to listen when he tried to explain why his report card had 3 grades that were not quite what we had hoped for. People always reveal more when you let them keep speaking. After a few minutes he asked if he could come by that afternoon. He said it would be easier to talk in person. I told him that was fine. When the call ended the silence returned immediately, filling the house again as if nothing had happened at all. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and poured myself a cup of coffee even though it was already cold. I drank it anyway. Living alone teaches you that some small routines are not worth restarting. As I stood there I thought about the last time Daniel had walked through the front door of this house. It had been a little over 5 years ago, shortly after my husband passed away. The grief had barely settled into the corners of the house when Rebecca began talking about boundaries. She used that word often. Boundaries about visits. Boundaries about holidays. Boundaries about how often grandparents should be involved in a young family's life. At first I tried to be understanding. Marriage changes people. It creates a new center of gravity around two lives instead of one. But over time the invitations stopped completely. Thanksgiving dinners happened somewhere else. Christmas mornings became private family moments that apparently no longer included me. Daniel would sometimes send short messages explaining that they were busy, that the children had schedules, that Rebecca was trying to keep things simple. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself young families go through phases. But months turned into years. Phone calls grew shorter until they disappeared altogether. Eventually I stopped setting an extra place at the table during holidays. The house grew quieter with every season. And now suddenly Daniel wanted to come talk about the house. I looked around the kitchen again, taking in the same worn counters and the small crack in the tile near the stove that my husband always meant to fix. This place held 30 years of our life. Every birthday cake. Every report card celebration. Every summer barbecue in the backyard. If Daniel believed I did not understand why he was calling after 5 years of silence, then he had forgotten something important about his mother. I might have been alone in this house for a long time, but I had not stopped paying attention. The afternoon passed slowly after the phone call, the kind of slow that only exists in a quiet house where nothing interrupts your thoughts. I spent the next few hours doing small things that did not really need to be done. I wiped down the kitchen counters even though they were already clean. I folded the same dish towel twice before hanging it back on the oven handle. At one point I walked through the living room and straightened the stack of photo albums on the shelf beside the fireplace. They had not moved in months, but suddenly I noticed the edges were not perfectly aligned. When you know someone from your past is about to walk through your door again, your mind begins traveling backward whether you want it to or not. I found myself thinking about the early years after Daniel married Rebecca. At first everything seemed normal. They visited on Sundays. Rebecca would sit at the kitchen table while Daniel helped his father with small projects in the garage. I remember making blueberry pancakes one morning and Rebecca telling me how much she loved this house. She said it felt warm and full of memories. At the time I thought that was a compliment. Looking back now, I wonder if she was studying it even then. The first real change came after their second year of marriage. Rebecca began explaining that their schedules were becoming complicated. She talked about routines for the children they planned to have one day. She said young couples needed space to build their own traditions. None of it sounded unreasonable on its own. The strange part was how quickly Daniel began repeating the same phrases. He started saying things like we are trying to simplify our weekends or we are keeping holidays smaller this year. At first I believed him. I told friends that young families were busy and that I did not want to interfere. But small details slowly started to feel different. One Thanksgiving Daniel called the night before and said they had decided to spend the day at Rebecca's sister's house instead. The following Christmas they told me they wanted to celebrate quietly with just their household. The year after that they said traveling during the holidays was too stressful for the children even though the drive from their house to mine was less than 20 minutes. Each explanation sounded reasonable if you listened to it alone. But when you lined them all up together they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. The invitations did not return the following spring or summer. Months passed without visits. Sometimes Daniel would send a short message saying they had been very busy. Other times there was nothing at all. Eventually the silence became normal. I stopped expecting the doorbell to ring. I stopped glancing at my phone every evening hoping to see his name. Life inside this house adjusted itself around the absence. That is what people do when something important disappears. They make room for the quiet and learn how to live beside it. And now, after 5 years of that quiet, Daniel was coming back to talk about the house. By late afternoon the sunlight had shifted across the living room floor, stretching in long quiet lines through the front windows. I could tell it was close to 4 o'clock without even checking the clock because the light always reaches the old armchair near the bookshelf at that hour. My husband used to sit there with the newspaper after work, his glasses sliding halfway down his nose while he pretended to read and actually listened to everything happening in the house. I walked slowly through the hallway and paused beside the narrow wall where we had marked Daniel's height each year while he was growing up. The pencil lines were still there, small dates written beside each one. 8 years old. 9 years old. 11 years old. The marks stopped when he left for college. I ran my fingers lightly over the wall for a moment and then continued toward the living room. The house had not changed much over the years. The same couch sat beneath the front window. The same wooden coffee table held a small scratch where Daniel once dropped a model airplane he built for a school project. 30 years of living inside these walls had a way of settling into every corner. Some people say houses are just wood and nails, but anyone who has lived in the same place long enough knows that is not true. A house remembers things. It remembers laughter from summer evenings when neighbors gathered in the backyard. It remembers the sound of a teenager running down the stairs because he was late for school. It remembers quiet nights when a married couple sat together without saying very much at all. When my husband passed away, the silence here became different. Not empty exactly, but deeper. For a long time I moved through the rooms expecting to hear his footsteps behind me or the sound of the garage door opening when he came home from the hardware store. Those sounds faded slowly over the months that followed. What did not fade was the routine he and I built together here. Every morning I still opened the kitchen window to let fresh air into the house. Every Sunday I watered the small flower bed along the front porch because he always liked the way it looked in the summer. These small habits kept the house feeling alive even after the people who once filled it had changed. I glanced at the clock on the wall then. 4:23. Daniel said he would come by in the afternoon, which meant he would likely arrive soon. I stepped outside onto the front porch and sat down on the wooden bench my husband built years ago. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had. Children riding bicycles down the sidewalk. A dog barking somewhere 2 houses away. The distant hum of a lawnmower starting up. Everything normal. Everything ordinary. Yet I knew the moment Daniel's car turned into the driveway this quiet afternoon would become something else entirely. Because people do not return after 5 years of silence unless they want something. And the way he said those words earlier that morning made it very clear what that something was. It was a little after 4:30 when I finally heard the sound of tires slowing down in front of the house. The quiet street carried the noise clearly, the low hum of an engine easing off the gas before turning into my driveway. I did not stand up right away. Instead, I stayed seated on the porch bench, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the yard while the car door opened and closed. For a moment there were only footsteps on the gravel path. Slow. Careful. Almost hesitant. When Daniel finally stepped into view, he looked older than the last time I had seen him. 5 years has a way of adding small lines around the eyes and a little gray near the temples. For a brief second I caught a glimpse of the boy he used to be, the one who ran up these same porch steps carrying his baseball glove after practice. But that moment passed quickly. Behind him came Rebecca, stepping out of the passenger side with the same composed expression she always wore, the kind of polite smile people use when they are entering someone else's home but do not intend to stay long. Daniel climbed the porch steps slowly and stopped a few feet away from where I sat. For a moment none of us spoke. The air between us felt strangely formal, as if we were 3 strangers meeting for the first time instead of family members who once shared holidays and Sunday dinners. Finally Daniel cleared his throat. He said it was good to see me. I nodded and told him he could come inside. The house was cool compared to the warm afternoon air outside, and for a few seconds they both looked around the living room as if they were noticing details they had forgotten. Rebecca's eyes moved carefully across the furniture, the staircase, the hallway leading toward the kitchen. Daniel stood near the coffee table with his hands resting on the back of the couch. I offered them coffee out of habit, the same way I used to whenever they visited years ago. Rebecca said no thank you. Daniel said he was fine without anything. That was when I understood they had not come for a visit. They had come for a conversation. Daniel began explaining that he and Rebecca had been talking recently about long-term plans. He said houses like this required a lot of maintenance. He mentioned property taxes and repairs and how difficult it must be for one person to manage a place this size alone. His voice was calm and careful, but the direction of the conversation was already clear. Rebecca added that there were many wonderful senior communities nearby where people my age could enjoy activities and meet new friends. She said the house could probably sell for a very good price in the current market. As they spoke, I listened quietly, watching the two of them standing in the living room where Daniel once built a blanket fort when he was 8 years old. Their words were polite and measured, but the message underneath them was unmistakable. They believed the house was a problem that needed solving. And they believed I was the person standing in the way of that solution. I listened without interrupting while Daniel continued explaining their idea, because that is what people do when they believe their plan is reasonable. They explain it carefully, step by step, expecting the other person to eventually nod in agreement. Daniel said the market for houses in this neighborhood had become very strong over the last few years. He mentioned numbers that sounded impressive when spoken out loud, numbers that could pay for a comfortable apartment somewhere smaller and easier to manage. Rebecca nodded along as he spoke, occasionally adding small comments about convenience and safety. She mentioned elevators, organized activities, friendly neighbors, and quiet communities designed specifically for people in their late 60s and 70s. Her tone was gentle, almost sympathetic, as if she were describing something that would obviously make my life better. I sat in the armchair beside the window and watched the two of them while they talked. The sunlight had shifted again, landing now across the rug in the center of the living room. Dust moved slowly through the air, floating in the warm light like tiny drifting particles of time. Daniel eventually stopped speaking and looked at me as if he expected an answer. I could see the faint tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held his hands together. Rebecca stood slightly behind him with the same polite expression she had worn since walking through the door. For a moment none of us said anything. Silence has a way of stretching longer than people expect when they are waiting for agreement. Finally, I asked a simple question. I asked them when they had started thinking about selling the house. Daniel hesitated for just a second before answering. He said they had been discussing it for a while now. Rebecca added that it was only because they cared about my future and wanted to make sure I was comfortable in the years ahead. Her voice was soft and measured, but her eyes moved again across the room, pausing briefly on the staircase and then the hallway leading toward the kitchen. It was the same careful glance she gave the house earlier when they first walked in. Daniel continued explaining that if we acted soon we could avoid certain maintenance costs that older houses often require. He mentioned roofing, plumbing, and heating systems as if he had studied a checklist before coming over. Every sentence led back to the same conclusion. Selling would be easier. Selling would be smarter. Selling would be better for everyone involved. When he finished speaking, he finally said the part that had been quietly waiting at the center of the conversation all along. He said there were a few documents that might need my signature if the process moved forward. Rebecca nodded once in agreement. I folded my hands in my lap and looked around the room again, taking in the familiar walls and the quiet memories resting inside them. After a few seconds, I turned back toward my son and asked another simple question. I asked him if he truly believed the house was his problem to solve. Daniel looked at me as if the question had caught him off guard. For a moment he did not answer. The silence settled between us again, heavier this time. Rebecca shifted slightly beside him and folded her arms in front of her, the polite smile still resting on her face but no longer quite as relaxed as before. Daniel finally cleared his throat and said that he was only trying to help. He explained that families should make practical decisions together, especially when it came to important things like property and finances. His voice carried the careful patience people use when they believe they are being reasonable. I nodded slowly while he spoke. Then I stood up from the chair and walked toward the hallway wall where the pencil marks from Daniel's childhood were still visible. The late afternoon light reached that corner of the house now, making the old markings stand out clearly against the paint. I placed my hand lightly against the wall beside the line that marked his height at 12 years old. For a moment I simply looked at it before turning back toward him. I told him that when he was 12 he used to race his bicycle down this street every afternoon after school. I reminded him that he once crashed into the mailbox at the end of the driveway because he was trying to ride without holding the handlebars. Daniel gave a faint uncertain smile as if he remembered the story but did not know why I was telling it. I continued speaking quietly, explaining that this house had seen every stage of his life. It had watched him grow from a boy who could barely reach the kitchen counter into a man standing in my living room discussing property values. Rebecca glanced around the room again while I spoke, her eyes moving briefly across the staircase and then toward the window. I told Daniel that houses like this do not simply become numbers on a market report. They carry years inside them. 30 years of birthdays. 30 years of holiday dinners. 30 years of ordinary mornings when his father read the newspaper at the kitchen table. Daniel shifted his weight from one foot to the other as if the conversation was moving somewhere he had not expected. After a moment he said that he understood the sentimental value but that practical decisions still needed to be made eventually. That was when I walked slowly back toward the armchair and sat down again. I folded my hands in my lap and looked directly at my son. Then I told him something he clearly had not considered before coming here. I explained that practical decisions about this house had already been made a long time ago. Not by him. Not by Rebecca. But by me. Daniel blinked as if he had misheard me. The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence carried a different weight. Rebecca's expression changed slightly, the polite calm fading just enough for a brief flash of curiosity. Daniel asked what I meant by that. His voice was careful now, more cautious than before. I leaned back in the armchair and rested my hands together while I spoke. I told him that when a person lives in the same house for 30 years, they learn something important about time. They learn that the future does not arrive suddenly. It arrives slowly, in quiet moments when you begin to realize that certain decisions cannot be left for later. After my husband passed away, the house became very quiet. The first few months felt especially long. Every room reminded me of something we used to do together. The kitchen window where he stood every morning with his coffee. The garage where he spent hours repairing small things that did not truly need fixing. During those months I spent a great deal of time sitting at this same chair where I am now, thinking about what the next years of my life might look like. I explained to Daniel that people often assume older individuals do not think about long-term plans, but the opposite is usually true. When the world grows quieter around you, you begin thinking more clearly than ever. That was when I made a few phone calls. Daniel frowned slightly as if he was trying to follow where the conversation was going. Rebecca watched me closely now, no longer pretending to admire the furniture around the room. I continued speaking in the same calm tone, telling them that one of those phone calls was to a lawyer who had handled several matters for our family many years earlier. We sat together in his office one afternoon and talked about the house, about my future, and about the possibility that circumstances might change over time. Daniel opened his mouth as if he wanted to interrupt, but I raised my hand gently and continued. I explained that during that meeting we reviewed the property documents and discussed what options existed if I ever wanted to make sure the house would be handled according to my wishes. The process took a few weeks. There were forms to sign and certain legal steps that needed to be completed properly. But eventually everything was finalized. Rebecca asked quietly what exactly had been finalized. I looked at both of them for a moment before answering. Then I told them that the ownership of this house had already been transferred into a legal trust more than 4 years ago, and that trust was created with very specific instructions about what would happen to the property in the future. Daniel stared at me as if the room had suddenly shifted around him. For several seconds he did not say anything at all. Rebecca was the first to speak. She asked what I meant by a trust and what exactly those instructions involved. Her voice was still polite, but the calm confidence from earlier had begun to fade. I folded my hands together and explained that a legal trust is simply a way of making sure certain decisions are respected in the future. It allows a person to protect something important so that it cannot be changed by pressure or sudden circumstances later on. When I met with the lawyer 4 years ago, we discussed several possibilities. One option was leaving the house exactly as it was and allowing it to pass down through the family. Another option was selling the property at some point and using the money for something meaningful. I paused for a moment and looked around the living room again while I spoke. The same afternoon light still rested across the rug, touching the edge of the coffee table where Daniel once built a small tower out of wooden blocks when he was 5 years old. Then I turned back toward them and explained that the trust included a very clear set of instructions. As long as I am alive, I remain the only person with the right to live in this house and make decisions about it. No one else can sell it, refinance it, or change the ownership in any way. Daniel shifted slightly where he stood, the confidence from earlier completely gone now. Rebecca asked what would happen to the house later, after I am gone. I answered that question calmly because it had already been decided years ago. I told them that when the time eventually comes, the property will be sold and the proceeds will be placed into a scholarship fund at the local high school. It will help students who cannot afford college tuition but work hard and want to continue their education. Daniel blinked slowly as if he was trying to process what I had just said. Rebecca did not speak for several seconds. The room felt very still. Finally Daniel asked why I would choose something like that. I looked at my son for a moment before answering. I told him that houses are meant to shelter people, but sometimes they can do more than that. Sometimes they can open doors for someone who needs a chance. I stood up from the chair and walked toward the front window where the maple tree cast long shadows across the yard. After a few seconds I turned back toward them. Then I said something simple that had taken me years to understand. Family is not defined by who stands in your living room when they want something. Family is defined by who stands beside you when they do not.